This is part 2 of the Worksheet 13 companion video. We are going to work through problem number 5 from the practice in this video. And what we're going to be doing is just creating a mini gradebook. And we're going to be using parallel arrays to hold the names and some assignments. And we haven't talked about parallel arrays yet, but parallel arrays are a really useful concept in data management. And let me pop open Photoshop real quick, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit about that before we actually start coding out our gradebook. I really like drawing out and visualizing my arrays. As you saw from the last video, we realized we had a problem because we did actually draw it out and kind of work through it a little bit. So, don't feel weird or feel like this is a step you should skip. It's a really useful step, and it's a really useful debugging tool. It's a very useful learning tool. So let's talk a little bit about parallel arrays and what they are. One of the good uses of parallel arrays is getting over the whole problem that you can only store one data type in a single array. So rather than trying to do some weird convoluted thing where you just make string arrays and you just store all of your numbers and names and everything like that in, as strings and read it all out, instead it's going to be a lot easier to work with parallel arrays. So let's kind of diagram this out with using for question 5, where we need to create a mini gradebook using parallel arrays to hold the names and one assignment grade for 3 students. So we don't want to make like a 2D string array where the grades are just sort of strings and we just convert them, because that's messy. We could potentially mess something up. Like, what if the user accidentally puts in a Q for a grade rather than an int? So we are actually going to be creating 2 arrays. We'll create a string array called names. And how many students do we have again? Let's see, 3 students. And so it'll be 3 in length. So if we want to kind of picture that, this is our array. It's called names. And it has 3 elements. It is element 0, 1, and 2. We'll then have an int array called grades. And it has 3 elements. So here is our array. And it has 3, 0, 1, and 2. I'll put grades here. So the whole concept of parallel arrays is that the element in one correlates to the element in another. So whatever student we put in element 0, their grade is stored in element 0. Whatever student we put in slot 1, their grade is put in slot 1, and 2 goes to 2. So like you see how they're kind of lined up. This is why they're called parallel. So they're lined up perfectly, and the information in one is correlated to the information in the other. So for instance, if we have student Bob got a 90. Student Sue got a 95. And student, I'm always bad about thinking about names. Student Finn got a 75. And the way that we would, set these up is we could easily then use loops, if needed, to get information out, or possibly even to set information, depending on how you're reading that in. Because if we do names 0 and grades 0, we're getting Bob's grade, the name and the grade. Sue 1, and names 1, grades 1, we're getting Sue's information. Names 2, grades 2, we're getting Finn's information. So this is the basics of parallel arrays, and as you can see, it starts getting a little bit complex. So it's a good practice to try to diagram these out so that you don't confuse yourself. And then you can always just kind of glance over at your paper to see what you're thinking. What if you work on it, come back a week later, and you don't quite remember what your arrays are? Obviously, you should be leaving comments in your code, but sometimes visually, it's a little bit easier to understand. So with that said, let's actually code that. So I did make a new C# script called gradebook, and I put it on my game object in here. And let me actually just take worksheet 13 off of that, so that it's just going to, if we run it, it's just going to run gradebook if we need to. So if we open up Visual Studio, we can get to coding. So since it's going to be its own thing, I'm not going to be too concerned about it getting too messy. So we can just do this in the start. If you really want to practice setting up, functions, feel free. It's good practice. But just for the sake of this demonstration, we're not going to do that. So let me delete that out. And let's get started. So let's first define our arrays. We have our string array called names. And we have 3 students. We have our int array called grades. And we need to have 3 grades since we have 3 students. We can then go through and fill these in. We could do names 0 is equal to Bob. Grades 0 is equal to 90. Names 1, I'm sorry, I mistyped. Grade 0 is equal to 90. Names 1 is equal to Sue, not do, Sue. Grades 1 is equal to, I think I said 92. Names 2 is equal to Finn. Grades 2 is equal to 75. And now if we were to print these out, we would say, if we wanted to print out Bob with their grade, Sue with their grade, and Finn with their grade, we could just say names 0 plus, we'll do a little bit of a space, plus grade 0. And let's just see what happens with this, just as a test, because we should see Bob with a space and then 90. Hit play. Bob and 90. And we could take this a step further. It's kind of, this is one way to do it, but what if we wanted to actually fill it in inside of Unity? So we could set that up real quick with an input field for like a name and a grade and a button to submit it and put it into the string. I think that would be good practice. So I'm going to set up my Unity. So you're going to see a blip in the video, and then we'll come back to this and I'll show you what I did. All right, so I have my canvas set up, and I'll kind of go through what I put in my scene. It's not too complex of a scene, but this will be a lot of good practice with manipulating data, reading in data, and displaying data. So I have a name input field for the user to put in a name. I then have a grade input field for the user to put in a grade. And I did make sure to set that grade input field to only take integers. I did create a button so that when we click this button, it's going to be like the submit button. I should probably rename that just so it's easier to find. It's going to read in the data from the name and the grades. And once we read that in, we do have a text called counter text because we want to keep track of how many students we've submitted into the counter. Since we can only do 3, we want to see which student we're up to. So this will also update when we click submit. I also have a button called display button. And when this clicks, we are going to display all of the names in the array. And I should call this display text. So click this, it'll display all of the names and the grades in the array. So, take a moment to get this set up. It should look something like this. This is just for you for practice. But make sure you get this set up, pause the video if you need to, and then we'll talk a little bit about coding. As far as coding goes, I did go ahead and add in the using Unity engine.ui at the top, and I added in all of those UI elements that I'm going to need access to when we need to read in and then display this information. So one other change I do need to make is I need to move these arrays to be class level arrays. We need to access these arrays throughout our code in different functions and functions and events. So if we keep them in the start, they won't be scoped to anything but the start. So I am going to just highlight these 2 arrays, hit Control X to cut them, and come up here and paste them in. I do probably want to make sure that these are private since we don't want to access them in the Unity editor. So we'll make these private real quick. We can then also go ahead and delete this since we're going to be kind of starting from scratch. So in the start, I do want to make sure that I change that display text to nothing. Display text.text is equal to nothing. And let's talk a little bit about that counter text. We're going to need to keep track of how many students we have put in the system. And we're going to need to do that with a counter. And since this is something that we're going to have to access, read, and manipulate through the whole program, we're going to need to make that a class level variable too. So up here, I'm going to make a new private int called counter. And when we start, we want to make sure that, when it starts, we haven't entered any students. So we're going to set that equal to 0. I'm also going to make sure that my display text is equal, displays that we have not put any students. But this is something I'm going to be doing multiple times. It's I don't want to say it's a complex piece of code, but it's more than just writing out a name. So why don't I go ahead and make a toPrint function that's just going to deal with when we call this, it's just going to update that counter text. And we can just go ahead and define that down here. Private void toPrint. The nice thing about this, we only have to code this once. And we can then just call toPrint in multiple places since we're going to have to do, we're going to have to do it again. And all we want to do is we want to say countertext.text is equal to students entered plus our counter. Again, it seems a little bit silly to do this, but this is a slightly involved line of code. We don't want to make a mistake, redoing this over and over again. Or what if we needed to change what that text was? And we don't want to have to hunt around for each place that we put student entered. What if it needs to be like students implemented? We don't want to, again, try to see if we can find that. So let's just do it this way. It's good practice too. So anytime we need to update that counter text, we just call toPrint instead. So let's keep going. So we got our display text set to nothing. We're setting that counter to nothing, and we are changing that display. So we could do a quick test on this. Actually, let's kind of define a couple other things. We'll set our stuff up in Unity, and then we'll do a quick test to make sure that our start condition does look the way that we want it to. We know we're going to need a public void on submit button click. And we're going to need a public void on, what do we call that button? Display. We'll call it on display button click. And this will probably be all that we need for this. So we got all of our public class level variables, so we can make sure those are set up in Unity. We have all of our functions and events. We can get those set up in Unity. So let's save this and take the opportunity to make sure that our Unity editor is set up correctly. So first things first, let me find where I put that script so that we can fill out all of these. Counter text is just counter text. Display text is just display text. Name input is just name input. Grade input is just grade input. That's why it's really nice to, name things in here the same as the script. Let's also set up those buttons real quick too, so that we don't have to think about them ever, we don't have to worry about this later on. Got that one, and let's go to the other one. Let's do on submit. Oh, sorry. On display. Okay, so they're set up. Nothing should happen though, but when we hit start, this should display the correct information. So let's see what happens when we hit play. Yep, students entered is 0. And we can click these, but nothing's going to happen. But it's nice to know that we're not getting any errors. All right, so the next part is just going to be to handle what happens when submit is clicked and then what happens when display is clicked. So on submit button click, first thing we need to do, what do we need to do first? Read in the input fields, store information into the correct elements in the arrays. The current counter correlates to where in the element correlates to which element the data goes into. And then after we put that information into those arrays, we need to raise the counter by 1. And then we need to update our text. And this is really how you should be putting your comments in as you go. like when you're doing your assignments, is you should be able to read it and know exactly what happens. And this can also be a really good way to kind of get your thoughts in order and know, step by step what you should be doing in your event or function. So first things first, let's read those input fields. We'll make a new string called name and set that equal to name input dot text. We'll make a new int called grade and set that equal to grade input dot text. But remember, this is a string. We can't implicitly convert that. So we need to make sure that we put this kind of nested inside an int dot parse so that it will convert it to an integer for us. Next, we just need to now store those in the appropriate arrays. We are working with, the first one. So we'll say name array. Is that what I called it? Oh shoot, names. I'm going to update this to say name array. I think that'll be a little bit easier and not as confusing. We'll say name array and grade array. So down here, we'll say name array at the current counter, because remember the counter starts at 0, so we know we're at element 0 is equal to name. Grade array at still the current counter is equal to grade. So these are parallel. What's going in slot 0 in one correlates to what goes in slot 0 in the other one. We could have, parallel arrays don't just have to be 2. We could have multiple types in here. Maybe we have a name array, we have a grade array, maybe we have an address array, we have a phone number array that's just storing all that information about students. So let's see, we did this, we need to raise the counter by 1. And then we need to update our text, which would be just that to print that we already coded out. So that's why this is nice if you're ever doing any kind of text changes to just make a function for that. So let's save it and we should test it. The only thing that we're going to be able to see is the student submitted changing. So let's hit play and let's try it out. I'll put my name in there and give myself a grade. Student entered 1. It is a little bit cumbersome that this doesn't get deleted. So when we go back to the code, we'll just kind of fix that real quick, that once we hit submit, it is going to reset these to nothing. Because that's really easy and it's just a nice way, nice for the user. And then we'll do fin got a 75. What's going to happen though if I click this button again? We have our 3 students entered. If we click it again, watch what happens. We get our out of range exception because we only have spot for 3 students. I'm not going to go over it in this video, but if you want to practice, a good practice, to continue this would be to do some, error checking. Not, I guess it wouldn't be called error checking, but we could check to see if we are full and then turn off that button. And that's really easy. We've done that kind of stuff before. It's just an if statement, looking at that counter, and then if we've hit that, turn off the button. But I do want to clear out those input fields, and all you need to do for that is just say name input dot text is equal to nothing, grade input dot text is equal to nothing. It's just a nice thing to do for the user so that this process is a little bit easier. So if we go back, If I put my name in there, it cleared it out, so it's a little bit easier to enter the information again. All right, we're on a roll. Let's do this last part real quick, where on display button click, what it's going to do is it's going to read both arrays, put it in a nice format, and print it to that text. And the way that we can do this would be to use a for loop. And since they're one-dimensional parallel arrays, we only need one for loop. We don't have to do any kind of nesting with this. So I do want to make my string I'm going to concatenate all this data onto. I'll just call it string print info or something like that, and set that equal to nothing. Since we're concatenating, we always want to double check that our string doesn't have anything on it to start with. We'll then do our for loop to step through this. So int x is equal to 0, x is less than, and I can, since these are parallel, I can just choose one of them. I'll just go with the name array and say name array dot length x plus plus. And I do want to kind of make sure that this data is looking nice. So I'm going to make sure that, you know, how I put this into print info is it's going to be the name, a colon, the grade, and then we're going to do a carriage return so that the next name, when we go through it, will be on the next line. All we need to do is say print info is equal to print info plus name array at whatever we're counting through on x. So it would start with 0, then go 1, and then 2. Plus, I want to do a colon and a space, plus grade array at whatever x we're at, since they're parallel, plus we need to do that /n so that next time we go through, you know, this is going to do a carriage return, so that next time that new name will be on the next line. Once we're done, that's it for this. This will step through both arrays and put them together. We just need to make sure that after this for loop, we update that text. And what did I call? I always forget what I call this one. Display text. Display text dot text is equal to our print info. And that's it. Let's save it. Hopped over to Unity and let's test this out. And let's see what happens when we click display without any names in it yet. Notice we are still iterating through that array, but you know, since there's nothing there, we're not, you know, we're getting, it's those ints just say 0, and we don't have any, we have no string, you know, that blank string for those names. But as we enter names, I'll put my name in, give myself a grade, hit submit. I can click display, and now my name is in there. Students entered, we entered 1. I'll put Bob in there. Nope, I'll put Bob in there. He gets a 90. And we can even click display again. And then we'll put Finn in there. And he got a 75. And we hit display and it displays it. And that is it for this question. I know we went a little bit above and beyond what was written out, but I think this is really good practice for really manipulating these arrays and how we can make like a nice little form for ourselves. Again, if you want some extra practice with this one, I would do some handling of like making sure that we don't get any errors with, you know, submitting too many. You could always force it to always display this as we go through. Maybe it would only display it up to what we have entered in, so we're not getting like that garbage data. That would be another fun thing to try if you want to challenge yourself. But that is it for part 2. In part 3, we are going to do problem 6, which is going to be a little bit more involved. Let's see. I'm going to make sure that, you know, when the video starts, I'm going to have the UI already set up and ready to go, so keep that in mind. with that.